See our numbers going up, and we are just here. I couldn't find an appropriate Hamilton shirt to wear, so I wore my Golden Girl shirt, which is also one of my favorite shirts. So there is something kind of golden about Hamilton, I guess. But
I didn't even think of that, and I could have worn several T-shirts which are not from the play, that are Hamilton related, and I was so busy thinking about the cocktail.
Well, I mean, priorities, right? I mean, we are drinking with historians. We're not T-shirts with historians. So
I had my priorities straight.
I have a shirt in Star Wars font that says "Burr shot first." It's one of my favorite shirts.
I have one, and I'm not going to be able to recreate the language, but those, for like fights, there's like a square in public spaces with so-and-so versus the so-and-so, Sunday. I have one of those for the duel.
Nice. Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like coming soon on July 11th, so-and-so versus so-and-so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but I mean, that was my main takeaway, again, having seen Hamilton for the first time when it was streaming, is like, don't do duels. Just like don't do duels. Like that's just a bad decision generally. So
you would have think they would have figured that part out.
Yeah, you would have.
Duels.
You would have thought.
Bad.
Okay, well, this is episode 7 of Drinking with Historians. We have me, I'm Varsha, and we also have Matt Gabriel from Virginia Tech. And our guest today is Dr. Joanne Freeman, who is a scholar of early America, but recently she's been really well known as a scholar of Hamilton. We'll start off by just asking, what's everyone drinking today?
Okay. I am drinking a drink that I believe, Matt, you emailed me or tweeted me about, the 1794.
Oh, yes.
So the 1794 is rye and sweet vermouth and Campari with a dash of bitters. And I am thematically drinking. And I'm very proud of myself. I like to without you guys, but...
I'm not having a cocktail. I'm just having rye. It's Michter's rye. I am trying to finish this bottle. Because I want to buy another bottle of it because it's so good. It's one of my favorite ryes.
Well, I have, I did something special. I mean, I wanted to do something. Not only do I have the Golden Girl shirt on, of course, but I decided, since I love figs and I love bourbon, I infused some bourbon. I bought some Old Grandad, which is kind of a cheaper kind of mixing bourbon. And I left some figs in there for a couple of days. And I have this I fig flavored bourbon, which I have. And then, for backup, for the second half hour, I have the bottle of Woodford, double barrels.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're ready to go there. So thank you so much, Dr. Freeman, for joining us today. I mean, I think that everybody's here. We're so excited to have you here because we're going to be talking about this kind of cultural phenomenon. And so I have to start with that. What do you think about Eurovision, a saga of, or a story of ice? I can't even get the name right. That was a terrible joke. So,
and still I panicked. So yeah.
But I guess we can talk about, let's talk about Hamilton. So Hamilton, streaming now, like a much wider audience. It was already a kind of a cultural phenomenon before then. And I've seen, like, one of the things that you've been engaged with as a very prominent, podcaster or professor on social media and stuff like that, engaging with a lot of people, is that what do you want people to take away from that if they want to know something more about Hamilton?
Well, I guess it's the second half of your question that I would kind of latch
Sure.
onto. It's going to say an obvious thing. It's musical theater. It's not a work of history. For a work of musical theater, it has a lot of history in it. I mean, they sing the freaking farewell address, right? They sing about the assumption of state debts in a national bank. I mean, these are things I didn't expect to see on Broadway. However, what I would most want people to take away is the fact that it's not all there, that there's stuff missing, that it's wrong, that things are made up. Teacher in me kind of pipes up for this, but the fact of the matter is, it's the most supreme teaching moment for early American history. And
Mm.
early American history, it's not like people were banging down the door, especially kids, like, I want in early American history. And now they are, right? And I think having the play as the hook, sort of the bait, and then bringing people in and saying, okay, now let's talk about what really happened and what isn't on the stage. Let's talk about the fact that in the room where it happened, there was probably at least one enslaved person. And let's talk about what that means. So it's a starting point, and it's a great starting point because it's popular culture. It makes you want to smile, and it has enough history in it that it's not sort of all over the map, but still huge gaps that we historians can address.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I mean, it's been pretty consistent about the people that we've, talked to over the last few episodes is using popular culture kind of as a jumping off point. And I mean, this is kind of the example writ large in kind of, contemporary American societies, because most people at least have kind of heard of Hamilton, even if they hadn't had a chance to see it on Broadway. Certainly now, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, like when you're teaching, when you're in the classroom, like, do you use other examples as well of popular culture to kind of bring them in? I mean, is Hamilton kind of the main go-to thing? I mean, we were joking about like kind of accidentally speaking in lyrics sometimes, right? Like, which I think, most of us are just inadvertently going to do. But like, so are there other moments that you can kind of do this?
Well, in my case, it's a little quirky because I've been studying Hamilton forever, right? I've been studying him for like 40 years. And for like 30 of those years, no one knew who he was. So, I've had him in my classes, and I use him to teach things, and I talk about different voices and different visions in the early Republic, and he's there, and Jefferson's there. He's been all over my courses, along with a lot of other people. All of a sudden now it matters that he's there, right? All of a sudden it appears as though I'm making some kind of a statement, when really all I'm trying to do is recreate the debate and sort of chaotic politics of the 1790s. But so he's been there all along. Ironically, all those years when I was studying him and talking about him, a lot of my message was boiled down to, you haven't heard of this guy, but he's really important, and he actually should be considered a founder. And now my message is, he's not so great. Like, take a breath. He's not as great as you think he is because of the play. So it's kind of a sea change.
That's exactly what I took a survey class for my in graduate school, my first year. And it was the day after I saw Hamilton live in LA, not with the original cast. I saw them live in LA, and then I go back to Berkeley for my class. And my professor was like, Hamilton's okay, but really, like, Thomas Paine is the real radical. Like, Hamilton wasn't that great. He's a financier. Like, come on. So I think that's the hard part for students. I use the cabinet battle to teach when I teach the early America stuff, and my students love it, but I really have to focus in on the fact that Hamilton isn't perfectly representative because it doesn't make any reference at all to Native Americans. And when you read basically any survey textbook nowadays of early American history or the American Revolution, it makes a big point of the fact that Native Americans were basically the big losers of the Revolution. And I was just wondering, so you mentioned how Hamilton is not everything's there, some of it's wrong. What is, like, since it's come out, what's like the one thing you have to remind students of when they talk about Hamilton with you? Not just the person, but the musical.
Let me think about that one. Well, in part, one of the things I have to remind them is something I've been reminding them for a really long time, which is, there are many different sides in that debate, and there wasn't one obvious good answer to the people at the time, right? And so one thing the play does is it suggests that, like, Hamilton is the forward-looking guy, think about modern America as we understand modern America, and Jefferson sort of represents slavery, and he's the backward-looking guy. But someone else could write that play, and Jefferson could be the more democratic guy who's so much more comfortable with the mass politics of the street, and Hamilton wants people to basically shut up and go home after they voted, and you would reverse it. So it's kind of, although I don't focus necessarily on just those people, the fact that they're both there, the fact that they engaged with each other so usefully for a couple of years, and that they had so much to say about it in writing, makes them great examples to use, kind of like you're saying with cabinet battles. It reminds people, which they don't expect, that it's an argument going on at that time, and it was a fierce argument, and people didn't agree, and it wasn't a bunch of dead white guys doing this, you know, which I think before the play is how they thought of the founding, right? It's like, and then it wasn't human, and there wasn't any contingency, and I think that's a useful thing that the play does too.
Yeah, that seems like it seems like a really critical point, right? Is that, and it's something that you know, I was talking with someone earlier about thinking about kind of nostalgia versus history, right? And that it's the job of the historians to talk about that kind of polyphony or even a cacophony of voices. Is that because we, especially with the founders, at least in political discourse and maybe in historical discourse to a degree as well, is that we think of them as like this one thing, this block, right? And, you know, Hamilton, the musical, kind of brings this out. And so, like, what are some other things about like the founders weren't this universal block? Like, they argued about things all the time, right? So what are other things that you would kind of want to highlight, either from, you know, from the play itself or from your own work, that it would be really critical to understand, not just Hamilton, but kind of the founders more generally?
Well, I mean, so I think two things pop into my head. One of them is Constitution wasn't inevitable. You know, the war wasn't, we weren't likely to win it necessarily. The Constitution, I have to say, I will not ever teach it quite the same way again. And it was weird because so almost all my undergraduate courses, students read the Constitution. And the way I've always taught it is, like, this is like a framework of a government. If you think about it, it's not very long. Think about what it does.
Sure.
It's really a structure of a government, and there's a lot of stuff that has to be filled in around the edges. So I've been saying that for a long time. I feel it differently now.
Yeah, okay.
You know? I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
it's gonna be more emotion when I teach that. But, you know, it's true. The other thing that I think I try to get people to understand in the later work that I've been doing in the 19th century is that the United States has not always been this sophisticated, advanced master of the universe. The rest of the world is like rumbling in the streets, and once again, you know, Daniel Webster, you know, that somehow or other we are this enlightened, genteel group of people. And my second book, the point of it wasn't to show, hey, look, these congressmen smacking each other around on the floor of Congress. But the picture painted in that book is no one really thinks about Congress with quite that amount of violence so consistently.
Yeah, my first year grad school, I also had to read Pauline Maier's Ratification. And basically, I go into this class. It was a class on the Constitution, taught by one of your colleagues, actually, Mark Peterson. I think he's at Yale now. Yeah, and so it was a class on the Constitution, and I ended up reading Pauline Maier's Ratification for the final essay. And like, I came into that class having like a very static view of Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and a very, like, you know, sort of Hamilton, like the play view of how the Constitution went about. And I left it being like, man, the Constitution sort of sucked. And the ratification process is also very, very, not just violent, but like very politically agitated. And it, like, there was a chance it would not happen.
It mattered.
And that's like one of the hardest things to convey to students, because in the United States, at least where we are right now, not just in California, but in a bunch of different states, depending on the high school you're in, you come out of high school with a certain like mythic view of the Constitution.
Sure.
Not just a mythic view of the Constitution and its debates and the ratification, but also a mythic view of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, and later on the later amendments. And so when you end up teaching slavery and then emancipation, it's so important to, like, you know, help students understand that there's a difference between a constitutional amendment being ratified and it's actually the enforcement, right? So you were talking about violence and your second book. I was just wondering, besides the famous Sumner incident, which is what a lot of students are taught, undergrads are taught, what do you like to highlight when you teach about political violence in Congress?
Oh, wow. It is true. Like, what was remarkable, it took me a really long time to write this book. And in all of that time, when I would say to people, I'm writing a book on physical violence in the US Congress, and 99% of the time, if they weren't a historian, they would say, there's that guy. It's like, Charles Sumner.
Probably had the hand motion too, right? Like, yeah.
They totally would. Like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, people know the caning of Sumner in 1856. I think one of the things, I mean, there are a lot of things one could pull from it. One of them, I guess now that seems particularly right in front of me, is the way that Southerners, because they were more likely to be armed and more willing to be violent, used threats and intimidation to silence or intimidate in one way or another Northerners to back down when they wanted them to back down, and that was a tool of politics. It wasn't like a freaky thing that happened. It was built into the system because the Southerners knew that they had a cultural advantage. And there are obvious ways in which, if you think about American politics and you think about our system of politics, the word system kind of leads you off in weird, like it's so set up and proper, but violence and systems of government aren't necessarily opposed, and ours wasn't. So the fact that that was built into the system, and the fact that people had to understand what that meant and then elect people that were willing to reckon with that, like that's the book was not timely at all when I started it. And yeah. And things happen, so yeah.
Yeah. So when you were talking about kind of Southerners or like, is there a particular time frame? I mean, I see the book on the shelf behind you. There it is. Yeah, find it at better booksellers everywhere. Is there a specific time frame in which becomes particularly acute? Because you mentioned kind of Southerners, and you've mentioned before kind of like at least in the the blurb for the book, kind of the slavery question, especially people think of again like the Charles Sumner incident. Like, is that the moment, or is that just kind of an anomaly within kind of a larger continuum?
Well, I guess I would say, so the book goes 1830 to basically 1860, roughly,
Okay.
roughly 1860. And, I would say, why I thought this, I don't know. But when I started, I was expecting to see like, well, the Civil War is at the end, and so the violence does this, right? But no, of course not. This is history. Yeah. So, it kind of comes up and down, and different things sort of set it off. But it begins to not come all the way back down. Probably, I would say the 1850s, right? So the gag rule, the gag rule debate about this, not discussing these anti-slavery petitions in the House, and part of the reason to do that was so that it would quiet down the House and there wouldn't be so much uproar, and instead just the opposite. It was a huge uproar, and there was a huge outburst of fighting in that period, which makes perfect sense, but was really not what people were expecting would happen. So for a whole bunch of reasons, some of them having to do with public opinion weighing in on this and voting it down, that was a big dramatic moment. But it's later in the 1850s when the push west is happening in earnest, and the compromise, the Missouri Compromise is no longer in place. So, they're constantly like, what's this state going to be? What's this state going to be? So that whatever's happening on the frontier is also happening in Congress. And again, it doesn't go like 1850 to 1860, but the pitch changes, the tones get more extreme. They're beginning to say things about, if we have to burn the Capitol to the ground, we'll burn the Capitol to the ground to get what we want, right? Yeah, exactly. That's the right expression. The rhetoric gets more extreme, and by the late 1850s, when you have the birth of the Republican Party as it existed at the time, they ran, like their campaign fodder, they advertised the fact that they were going to fight the slave power. That was one of their slogans. And in Congress, they did that for real, right? Some of them came with weapons. They came with guns. And they went into Congress, sat alongside these Southerners, and did something that Northerners hadn't done a lot of in the past, which is show that they were perfectly willing to fight. Their constituents sent them there knowing that they were going to be a different kind of Northerner. They stand up all the time in Congress and say, we're a different kind of Northerner, you can't push us around. And so the last 5 years there are pretty intense. If you think about new kind of Northerners, and the Southerners are sort of like, whoa, wait, this is not the dynamic we have been enjoying for the past few decades. So, it kind of builds to the Civil War, but it's way more interesting than that.
Do you think it dies down completely after 1865, or is it like a new type of like political violence, or does political violence in Congress itself sort of like dissipate a lot after 1865?
Well, It's interesting. So first off, when the Southerners leave, when they secede from the Union and they're gone, I found like a New York Times editorial, I think, and they were like, you don't have to have your hand on your gun when you're walking around in Washington. This is so great, right? The Southerners aren't here. So, and Congress, there isn't violence in Congress, but because there isn't violence and threats in Congress, the language gets worse and the insults get worse and the behavior gets worse. So, you know, one of the reasons for dueling, one of the sort of rationales for it is if you know you might get shot for your words, you're going to be really careful about your words. And so you're seeing these people who no longer have to be careful about their words. And I was like, huh. Maybe there was a little something to that dueling logic. Then after the war, when Southerners begin to come back, particularly the first few states trying to get back into the Union, they bring violence with them, but it doesn't play the same way, and it doesn't continue. So there's a Louisiana congressman who comes armed, feels that he and his state are being disrespected in the way that they're not yet being allowed back in the Union, and in the Capitol sort of lays in wait for the chief person who's keeping Louisiana out with a cane, and he violently canes this guy in the Capitol, right? And he had, you know, Sumner, Preston Brooks, who did the caning, had 2 friends with him. This guy, you know, he had 2 friends with him. So it's like this weird echo. But what happens is that Northerners, and particularly some of the more wry sort of Northerners, stand up and they say basically, okay, some of you in this room weren't here in the 1850s and 1840s. I was, and I remember that. Do we want to let that back in? And it becomes this really interesting conversation where it's like, is that something we want to go back to? And, you know, he's half kidding, but he's half not. And you suddenly realize that the power dynamic has totally shifted. And so, you know, that's one reason among many that violence doesn't pick up again. I think Southerners transfer a lot of their violence to home turf and Reconstruction.
I'm curious too about, so if we can go back to Hamilton for just a minute, is that, you know, some of the silences that, I mean, it's musical theater, right? It's a fictional thing. So, but, you know, thinking about kind of what's not mentioned in that kind of discussion. And one of the things, you know, you've mentioned in the past is about kind of Native Americans. One thing that's been brought up repeatedly now that it's been streaming and there's been larger conversations about the slavery question, especially Hamilton as an abolitionist, really problematic. So could you talk a little bit about that, like, not necessarily kind of about the thing itself, but about Hamilton, about kind of the founders' debates about these things?
Sure. One of the things about Hamilton, and I think probably people didn't think about it until this moment when everyone seems to know who he is, because he was something of a mysterious founder, his origins are less well known, he didn't talk about them at all, he becomes a really handy person to pin things to. You know, so there aren't a lot of founders, for example, that you could claim in any way were abolitionists. He wasn't, and I'll come back to that, but you can claim that and you won't have a lot of evidence to the contrary. And because no one really knew who he was, I think he held a lot of weight. There were years ago, I was working on an exhibit with an organization, and Hamilton was in it at some point, and the people in the room wanted to say he was an abolitionist. And I said, yeah, but he wasn't an abolitionist. And one of the people funding the project said, well, at least give him that. And I was like, what? Wait, my job as a historian is not to like make deals with people's reputations, you know? So he like holds a lot of weight. And I think particularly right now, people really, really, really want a founder who is very obviously on the right side of the race and slavery question. And, you know, he ends up kind of carrying that weight. You know, he clearly, on the one hand, is opposed to slavery. He belongs to the New York Manumission Society. On the other hand, his father-in-law owned enslaved people, and at various points, he may have been helping in those kinds of transactions. He has there's one letter he writes during the Revolution in which he talks about slavery, and almost nothing else. Now, this is the guy who really talked his way into a duel and death. You know, this is a guy who like didn't watch his words. And for that guy to not discuss slavery in 27 volumes in any kind of a sustained way, you know, he was anti-slavery, but also very bought into the system as it existed. And if slavery was going to change, he wouldn't be the guy who stepped forward and was like, freedom now. He would have said, well, let's slowly work our way there. Like property rights and all the other things that a sort of elite white guy would have said at the time. So I think that's some of what the play does, is he becomes the person we want someone to be, and he serves that purpose. And we, you know, we're having such a hard time for all kinds of good reasons integrating the founding as we were taught it, and the founding and the realities of it as it happened. And I think in some ways Hamilton was like this little figure who stood on the cusp, right? That he's a founder, but look, he was like on the good side. I understand the impulse, but and I feel like the history police by being like, I'm sorry, you know, I'm sorry, Hamilton wasn't an abolitionist. He wasn't, but that's a more accurate way of understanding the period. They're not two sides. It's not, I love it, I hate it. It was way more complex than that. There's a quote in the book I just wrote from a New Hampshire guy, the main sort of character of the book. And he's talking about, I think in the 1850s, what he thinks about slavery. And it's this amazing sentence in his diary. And I'm not going to do it justice. It's like, I hate slavery and I think it's wrong. And I don't think we should talk about it, but we should end it. But it's dangerous to talk about, and maybe the state should handle it, but the northern states don't need to have anything to, it's like, it makes no sense. And he's weaving together like 8 different things that cannot exist at the same time in his diary, and he's not pausing to think about the fact that it makes no sense, but it really shows you someone in the moment unable to find his way to a place that he can put his feet down in a comfortable way.
It makes me sympathetic towards Twitter, really, nowadays. The way this gentleman was kind of wrestling with things kind of out loud. So, yeah. Sorry, Varsha, you were going.
I was just going to say, like, this is sort of how I teach Jefferson. So we have to read a lot of, in the survey that I teach, we read a little bit of Jefferson's writing, slavery. And so a lot of people either come in with a very limited understanding of Jefferson on slavery, and a lot of people have like a very detailed understanding, or where all they know is that he enslaved Sally Hemings, and Sally Hemings was not a consensual, you know, partner of Jefferson, and that's what they know. And after they read his writings, they sort of like better understand the fact that it's not about tearing down Jefferson or building him up. It's about fully understanding that there are so many ways to take the slavery debate in the 1790s and the early 19th century that it makes sense that it took white people this long, at least politicians this long, to finally get to a point of conflict, because for the longest time they're debating it in their own heads, and that's what's interesting about it. And then recently, you know, a lot of people have been talking about Confederate monuments, so I just had like one tiny question on that. When it comes to, since you study a lot of these early American figures all the way to the 1860s, when it comes to not just Confederate monuments, but like monuments towards people who held enslaved people, or even people who were, you know, pro taking away native lands, where do you stand on how to memorialize them, how to actually study the history? Do you need to look at a statue to know the history of something, or is
okay, yeah, so those are 2 different questions. The second one is the easy one, which is, you know, nothing gets erased when you take down a statue. A statue is the history of the people who put it up, right? And the people who put it up to make a point about who owns that space and who belongs in that space and what's being recognized in that space. And that, a lot of that is a 20th century phenomenon. So that's sort of a different issue. But as far as, you know, slaveholding people and people who are not Confederates, because that's kind of easy, right? Well, it's like, well, they fought a war against the United States. They fought a war in the service of slavery. I'm okay with taking down Confederate statues. They're not going to be erased. That's like, you know, our Civil War. If people know anything, that's kind of pretty much what they know. But I think with the founders and other more complicated figures, first of all, I'm not the person, obviously, to make that kind of decision, but I do think it's worth thinking about the fact that we're in a moment of conversation, and sometimes it's a really angry, justifiably angry conversation, but we're at a moment where we're figuring out who we've been and who we are, and whose voices get to be heard and whose voices don't, and what is part of our story and what isn't part of our story. And that's an angry conversation, and it's a fraught conversation, and it's going to go wrong sometimes. You know, we're going to tear down statues that 10 years from now, we might be like, I wish we hadn't done that. And, you know, we're going to be in this moment where we're reckoning with what we think. But we're really in the midst of a really fraught, important conversation. So I guess part of me just thinks, I don't think every slaveholder's statue needs to be torn down. I do think we need to think about whose statues are up and why they were put up and who put them up and what they represent. So, you know, I'm sure that we can figure out reasons why some people stand and some people don't as far as statues go. But this is such a obvious example of a conversation in the process of happening and unresolved. We're smack in the middle of it, and it's politicized, and it's personal, and it's national, and that's going to be a really hard conversation, and it's going to be a conversation that wanders off in all kinds of directions that we didn't predict. And part of me just feels like we need to take a step back and allow the conversation to happen, aware of the fact that some things will happen that you're like, that shouldn't have happened. It's like, well, yeah, okay, but we're figuring it out.
Yeah.
It's easier
Yeah.
It's like the ratification process. We're figuring it out. It's a contingent process.
It is. But I mean, this kind of thing can't be decided by a committee. It has to be worked out by the public, right? And how does the public work out a process, right? Protest, voting, I mean, by expressing who they are in some way in a public space. So that's where we are. And it's easy for me to say, like, let the conversation go. But I think people who are sort of already up in arms about this can't go on, part of me feels like, well, it's going to go on, and it should go on until we get to a point that feels that we're engaged in a conversation again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you mentioned that too, because it's not, it's almost invigorating, especially like as historians, to see this process playing out right in front of us. Is like we're talking about what the Civil War meant, really, and not just what the Civil War meant, but the process of Reconstruction and the redemption and all those types of things with these Confederate monuments. And then we're even talking about Columbus. We're talking about the founders. We're talking about even as a medievalist, right? Like in the city of St. Louis, like there's a protest around the statue of King St. Louis, right? A medieval king. Like that stuff matters. I mean, like and so the fact that we're bringing in all these types of conversations, this is the messiness, the reality of history, and it's not just us, like you said. It's people at the public who are having these types of conversations. So this is a real opportunity for us to engage, right?
It's a really interesting, sometimes fraught moment to be a historian, right?
Yes.
Because the historian brain is like, this is clearly a historical moment, and I'm looking for patterns, and how have these things resolved in the past? And like historian brain is always like, blah, 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 blah. And then, non-historian brain is, I'm too anxious to think about this, right? So really interesting time to be a historian. I'm actually writing a piece right now about that, about being a historian in that moment and what it feels like and what you feel like you should be doing, and then what you are or are not able to do, because it's such a weird moment. And some part of you feels kind of Cassandra-like, like, oh, people, but it's complicated, and I guess I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
I sort of just feel like anytime not something happens, but anytime I feel like people want me to put my historian brain on, all I can say is, yeah, it's complicated, folks. Recently, there was an ad that was like, the background of the ad was Reagan giving a speech, and the images were all Trump's policies. And everyone, like liberal, conservative, whatever, on Twitter were like, oh my God, what an amazing and effective ad. And like, human me was like, okay, I mean, I guess it could be effective, but historian me was like, there's no data on this ad yet. But on top of that, I study the 1980s, and like, you know, what Reagan is saying versus what he did, it's like completely different. So yeah, and so I think that's what makes it, it's really sort of hard, not just like ideologically and also like physically, but it's really hard like personally to be a historian during a historical moment, because you have to choose between being, you know, the annoying person who's like, that's not correct, versus being, yeah.
Yes, the history police, yes.
Frustrating.
Historians are generally annoying sometimes, so yes, that's what it is. That's why we drink, right? So,
We should.
yes, or we should, yeah, absolutely. So we've actually moved into the second half hour. I want to transition because we have a ton of really fascinating, wonderful questions from our participants, and so we move into what I will gently dub yet again the drunk with historians half an hour.
Because we've
Part
had to
of
have
the thing. So that's right. Yeah. So there's progress. We're moving towards. So one of the things that a couple of people have obviously a lot of questions about Hamilton, the musical specifically, is that one of the things that a couple of people have brought up is about the extramarital affairs, the sex scandals thing. Could you talk a little bit about that? And, you know, I mean, it's portrayed in a particular way. There's the, I can't remember the packet that he put together. Yeah. So something like that. Like, was this particular, was it extraordinary when it actually happened? I mean, like it becomes kind of a focus. Like how does that work within kind of the actual past?
I mean, I don't think that the simple fact that Hamilton was an adulterer in and of itself was damning. You know, I think there was a lot of stuff going on in the early Republic. But what he did about it is the part that made it unusual, right? He had this affair with this woman. It ends up that he's being blackmailed and committing adultery with her, and people claim that the little slips of paper that say, here, I'm giving you $1,000, somehow suggest he's speculating with government funds. And he writes this pamphlet that's like, I'm not speculating with government funds. I'm an honest public servant and an adulterer. And then goes into great detail about the adultery, right? And when he met her and what she looked like. And I can't resist quoting my favorite line from the Reynolds pamphlet. He describes how she came to his office saying she needed to get back to New York and she didn't have the money, and she heard he was a charitable man. And he goes to her home that night and he writes in the pamphlet, I was shown up to her bedroom where, and this is almost a direct quote, it soon became apparent that more than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. So he writes this tell-all pamphlet. And he includes the letters to and from him and Maria Reynolds, you know, because he's being lawyerly. Like, let me really prove to you, this is what happened. So part of the craziness of it is the fact that he went public with it. And he says in it, everyone's always out to get me. I think the Jacobin Scandal Club, they're out to get me, but they're not going to get me. I'm going to step forward and explain exactly what happened. I'm always a trustworthy public servant, but I happen to be an adulterer too. And yeah, that was scandalous. Long time ago, I saw a British version of the Reynolds pamphlet with little portraits of Maria Reynolds and Hamilton that looked nothing like, they're like random people. So, you know, it was scandalous, but it wasn't scandalous just because it was adultery. Actually, can I be crazy and go grab something to show you?
Sure.
Okay.
This is unprecedented, folks.
You'll see why. Okay. You'll see why. This is an original Reynolds pamphlet.
Whoa.
How could I not show people this?
Historians love primary sources. This is so perfect.
Yeah. So it's an original who someone nicely bound.
Oh my.
But yeah, and what's crazy, again, for me personally, is that I owned all this stuff. I had all this stuff. I'm thinking about all this stuff. I've owned that for like 2 decades at least. And I could buy it because it didn't matter, right? So the people weren't paying $1 bazillion. Right? You know, it's Hamilton. So it's a truly weird moment.
There's another really good Hamilton question that somebody asked, and it relates to, you know, the Supreme Court term just ended. And so somebody asked, Jim asked, you know, how much do you think the ideas expressed in the Federalist Papers should weigh in our current interpretation of the Constitution? And I know you're not like exactly a legal historian or a SCOTUS historian, but you know, recently I had to reread Jack Rakove's Original Meanings, and so I was thinking about originalism, but generally I was more thinking about how like Americans, specifically like a certain type of like Americans who are really into legal stuff, are like obsessed with the Federalist Papers. As someone who's probably had to read all 51 of Hamilton's writings, specific papers, as well as those written by Jay and
Those
Madison.
other ones, yeah.
Those other ones, like. Do you think, maybe not all the founders, but do you think most of the founders intended the Constitution to be a static document, as something like this is how the Supreme Court should interpret it for all and all? Or do you think people, not just like the major founders, but do you think people in the 1790s were thinking, no, it's okay for the Constitution to change, especially those who wanted the Bill of Rights?
So there's a couple questions. I'll start with the Federalists and I'll kind of segue to the Constitution. So the Federal, and you're right, I'm something not of a legal historian. I'm not a legal historian. I'm not a political scientist. But the Federalist essays are treated by many as like the Bible of the framers of the Constitution. The interesting thing to remember about them is they weren't intended to be an objective explanation of the Constitution. I always tell my students they were a commercial advertisement for the Constitution. They were trying to sell people on the idea that they shouldn't be scared, this is good, and here are all the reasons it's good and all the ways in which we covered all your fears, so buy the Constitution. You know, they had a purpose. And so they're used in one way, but they weren't written for that purpose, which gets to your second question, which is like, did the founders, the framers think this was going to be a static document? You know, Hamilton didn't even think the Republic would survive his lifetime. You know, I mean, so they take Hamilton for an example because he was so grounded in like law and order and the Constitution being respected. He wanted the document to be really respected as a document because that would represent in his mind, I think, stability, political stability. And so he freaked out about that a lot in the 1790s and wanted to bring in the military when people seemed to do unconstitutional things, which is what Hamilton would do. So in that way, some of them were worried about the Constitution itself, but I don't think anybody assumed it would, you know, I mean, there's a reason why there's an amendment process. And this gets back to contingency. You know, I've never done, this would be really interesting. Someone out there watching this, it would be really interesting to see if you could figure out from some of the people in this period, particularly the framers, what they thought about what would happen. There's a really interesting Hamilton document that he wrote, I don't know, 10 days after the Constitutional Convention. And he went to his home and he sat down at his desk, and it's a memo. So it's to him, and it's very lawyerly. And he's basically like, okay, what do I think is going to happen next? And he's like working it out on the paper. And he says, and this is going to be a really bad paraphrase. He says, well, you know, maybe it'll get ratified. And if it's ratified, then maybe George Washington is probably going to be president. And if he's president, people are going to trust the people he puts in office, and that's going to be good. And the people will follow the government and believe and stick with the Constitution because of all those things. I said, but if for some reason Washington doesn't become president, or for some reason people don't buy into it the way that they should, or states begin to turn against each other, well, then we're going to have, you know, foreign countries will sweep in and maybe swallow up some of the states, or the states will form separate confederations with each other, and we will no longer have a union. And he creates this like apocalyptic vision. And then he says at the end of the document, that's probably what's going to happen. So he, you know, when he says in his letters, I'm going to support this, I'm going to push things as far in the direction as I think they should be as I can without violating the document. But on some fundamental level, he did not think it was going to work. And so, you know, he says, the last letter he writes before the duel, he says, one of the reasons I'm dueling is I'm going to be needed in future, for example, if the government collapses. And if I don't defend my reputation, I can't be a leader. So, you know, people don't normally study that. It's something I'm really interested in, the fact that he bought into the experiment, and I think he was honest. He was going to push things as far as he could in the direction that he wanted, which is more like Great Britain, but he wasn't going to push it to the point that he thought he was violating what everybody had agreed upon. Others would disagree and be like, well, you sure as heck did violate what we agreed upon. But, you know, you don't expect that. And when you weave that into how these guys are thinking about the Republic and the Constitution, I don't know, it becomes far more interesting, right? It's not, we created a document and then put it in a case and then everybody bowed down to the case. And, you know, in this period, it's why one of the reasons why I love the period. I have a habit of saying, this is why I love the period. And then I state one thing and then 2 days later, I'm like, no, this is why but one of the things I love about it is it's improvisational, right? There's contingency and it's improv and they don't know what's going to happen and they're figuring it out and they're freaked out about the fact that they don't know what they should do and they're obsessing about details that you can't believe. Are they really talking about how much lace should be on their jackets as leaders? Because too much lace means they're monarchical? Yes, they talked about that. So it's fascinating to me because it's people creating something and they happen to be a paper focused generation. So they put it all down on paper.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about how like the violence, at least the same level of violence, doesn't really stay after 1865. Somebody asked a really interesting question. Do you think contemporary politicians gossip? I know they don't actually like, you know, cane each other, but do you think they gossip or actually have the same concept of honor that you discuss in Affairs of Honor? Like one example that comes to mind is one of the first days of the Trump administration, Mitch McConnell is like, nevertheless, she persisted. And that's become like, you know, Elizabeth Warren's like slope since then, right? And there's a lot of discussion in the House as well as in the Senate recently since the recent presidency of like, you know, insulting other people on the floor of Congress, all that kind of stuff. Has all of that changed since the end of the Civil War, or do you think some of it stayed the same?
Well, it's changed in a lot of different ways. My immediate thought in answering that question is it's complicated by technology, right? So McConnell says that, but she persisted, and we know it in 10 minutes, right? Boom, social media, it's on cable TV, it's everywhere. So, you know, it flies in a different kind of a way and has a different kind of an impact that doesn't necessarily connect with how it happened before. That's the thing I'm really interested in is, and I've written about it in this book, and I'm just generally, at some point I know I'm going to come back to it, and that is, how does technology change democracy? Because it does, right? Technology means that politicians and the public are interacting in different ways, and that's at the core of our system. So what happens when that changes dramatically? Like the telegraph had this huge impact. Social media, you know, this is yet another way in which we're in this unfolding historical moment where, and particularly because you have a tweeting president, right? We're sort of learning what this means in one way or another. So honor is about performance. And because technology changes the audience, that's a hard one to play against. I think it's different, but I think it would be really interesting and require longer than 2 minutes for me to figure out the many ways in which it is different, but it is not the same. There was a ritualized, contained way of thinking about it before that I think does not exist anymore.
Well, I mean, you know, although we expect kind of all historical answers to be answered in less than 2 minutes, we do realize, of course, that, you know, some of these things, as Varsha said earlier, like, it's complicated, right? Like that's what historians like to say. So the next question I feel compelled to ask because it was asked by my dean. So like I might get in trouble if I don't ask it. So who I think you may know, Laura Belmonte, is what got you interested, and other people have asked as well. It's like, you know, you've been working on Hamilton for a long time, and like, you know, even before kind of it became this cultural phenomenon. Look, why Hamilton? Like, what got you interested in Hamilton in the first place?
Well, I'll give the short-ish answer.
Sure.
I was of the right age when the bicentennial happened. That, you know, if you're like 11, 12, 13 when the bicentennial happened, and you're that person. So part of what launched me was the bicentennial and the movie 1776, which was kind of the Hamilton of its moment, although by far not so popular. But it like sucked me in the same way that Hamilton sucks people in. And I started reading because I wanted to understand who the people were, and actually more than anything, I wanted to understand who the people were. And I went to the library and I was just like reading biographies, and I think I started at A. I think I was like, I don't know, you know, and my town didn't have a real library. So this is actually less scary. We had a bookmobile, but still, I think I started with Adams and worked my way. And when I got to Hamilton, I stopped because he wasn't in 1776, but he was seemed to be in that category of founder, and he was a strange person with this weird beginning. He's in the Caribbean and he dies dramatically in a duel, and he was this young man who wanted to achieve great things, and I think as a 14-year-old, I was like, yeah.
That's the guy, right? That's the guy, yeah.
That's the guy, and I think you're not going to believe I'm saying this. What are the novels, the young adult novels about a vampire who's in love with a woman?
Twilight.
Yes. Okay. So, thank you. Yes. Okay. So Twilight is about a man who has like special powers, but he's deeply flawed, and you know, right. Hamilton has that same appeal, I think, or had the same appeal. I can't even believe I'm saying this. To me as a I think as a preacher, I was like deeply flawed, extreme, you know, emotional. I was like, I'm just interested in this guy. Now I can't even believe I'm saying this in front of 393 people. But but what happened, the good thing that happened out of that is I didn't go wandering off in that direction. I read a biography called, because of my interest, The Young Hamilton. And I thought, I'll really figure him out now. And for some reason, I didn't like it. I can't remember why. I didn't believe it. And I went to the library and I asked the librarian what this guy read that gave him the right to say what he said. And she pointed me to Hamilton's letters. And I once again, this is a lot about me. I went to volume one, and I just like worked my way through. It was like,
start at the beginning.
That's right. I'm like so predictable. It was the real stuff, right? This was the real stuff. No one was going to tell me what it meant. No one was going to interpret it. I could figure out what it meant. So I read Hamilton's 27 volumes of his papers for decades. I would get to the end and then I would go back and start again. And I had notebooks where I was taking notes. I mean, it's insane. When I look back, I had figured out part of my dissertation decades past in the middle of a notebook. I was like, you know, he's involved in these honor things that don't look like duels. So that what got me in was the people and primary sources, right? And then I was like, I wanna understand who these people were and why they did what they did. And in a way, that's kind of still what I do in my work. It's not focused on one person, but what I'm interested in is how emotion shapes politics. So it's, Hamilton kind of led me in a good path. That's not unrelated to the kinds of things that kind of sucked me in when I was 12 or 13. I can't believe I compared Hamilton and Twilight.
Hamilton is like Twilight. You heard it here. Like, it's going to be on CNN tomorrow. So there you go. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
I was the exact same way, because back in, I think it was 4th grade, or maybe 5th grade, we had to do a diorama on like Hamilton versus Jefferson. And you know those shoebox dioramas? And I had the most fun doing that. And I came out of that being like, yeah, Hamilton's the cool guy here. But
that boy though, he's the best.
Until like all the way until A-Push, like way into like high school, I had like an obsession with both Hamilton and Jefferson, because I just found it so cool that like these are the two people, at least for me. I know like a lot of people back, you know, 10, 15 years ago don't really care about Hamilton. At least for me, I was like, these are like two people that are like so definitive. But when I got to college, I asked a professor of mine, because this is what I did before I really knew what I was doing. I asked him, because I'd never met an early Americanist before or taken a class on early America. So I remember asking him, who's your favorite founding father? Because this is what 17-year-old me thinks college professors want to be asked. So I asked him, and he's like, I don't believe in the concept. And he spent like 5 minutes talking about how there's actually, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of founders all across early America, like all around early America, that are not in, you know, Philadelphia.
Good answer. It's a good answer.
And but like that answer really pushed me into like thinking about how people's stories are not just the ones that are like written down. There's just so many others. Right. And that leads me to a really cool question that somebody asked, is like, you know, a lot of people have asked this. When you teach undergrads, and, you know, we're dealing with this issue now because high schoolers, even middle schoolers, sort of like come out of school with this mythologized vision of American history. Right. Depending on the state, they might have a misinterpretation of the Civil War and other things. What is like one thing, content-wise or even skills-based, that you would change about high school history education if you could? Like,
The mythology, the
Yes.
mythology, the fact that students learn it's all good, it's all great, everything was wonderful, the people were great, they wanted only great things, everything good happened, and look where we are. That does so much damage. You know, I mean, on a more serious note, I tweet this all the time. I think Americans are so immersed in the idea that we are exceptional and things always work for us that they can't see the danger we're in right now. So I think the mythology and some of what we're arguing about now is people who learned history a certain way and own it in that way, and it's personal to them, and other people who want different voices and a different kind of history. And you know, it's a personal debate because it boils down to so many things. You know, what you think America is and everything else. This goes back to what we said earlier, but there's a reason why it's an important conversation.
Yeah. So, like, one of the things, another thing that the other people have asked is the other kind of musical theater related to the founders, which is 1776. You know, you mentioned that earlier about kind of, you know, the bicentennial and stuff like that. Like, what are your thoughts on 1776? Like, is that, should we look for kind of the you know, if there are any Hollywood producers watching right now, you know, kind of the next kind of revision of that or something like that? Like, I mean, how does that deal with the founders?
Again, I'm not the one who should be deciding as a white female person.
Well, for the purposes of this, you are, though.
I would say if someone is going to write a show about the founding, 1776 shouldn't be the one they rewrite. They should write something that's different and more complex, and different characters. That said, 1776 did well some of what Hamilton does well, which is it made the American founding human, and it introduced the idea that nothing was decided in advance. It was contingent, like who knew what was going to happen. And those were important things. And it was just the simple fact that these were real people that set me off reading, right? I wouldn't have been reading anything if it were just like, and then the Constitution was written and the founders wrote, you know. But people, oh, okay, well then I can kind of figure out what they're doing and what they thought. So I think there's more than one historian of early America in my cohort who has told me, and I will not out them, that 1776 inspired them to move in this direction. I am one of them, but it was mostly because it made that period human, and gave me a trail to start to follow of people. And once I was on the trail, then I was just interested in where it went.
Awesome.
My last question is, I know a lot of people are gonna like try to get to a bookstore immediately after this to try to find either your book or another book on early America. A couple people have asked this. What is like one book by a historian that you wish you had written? Or the answer to that question is, what would you recommend if you are interested in early America? Somebody asked what you wish you'd written, but.
Wow, that I wish I'd written. That's a hard question, and I tend to shy away from those questions because then someone's going to be pissed off. Someone's going to be happy, and someone's going to be like, "Gah!" And I don't know. You know, the books that have inspired me inspire me because there's a depth in them and a feeling in them and writing that's like really gripping and really good. So I don't know if there's one book that I would say guided me. I would say there are all kinds of books that are launching points. I mean, actually one book, if you're interested in, for example, the Declaration of Independence, Pauline Maier is a wonderful historian, and she wrote American Scripture about the Declaration and the writing of the Declaration. It's a fascinating book. It's not super long. She has a chapter in there, and I use it sometimes in teaching, that's titled The Other Declarations. And it's the fact that all of these towns were creating their own declarations of independence. There wasn't only one conversation. So, and it makes it human. It tells the jokes that Franklin was telling Thomas Jefferson as the Declaration was being edited. I mean, it's human and wonderful. She was a wonderful, warm person. So that's not going to cover everything, but it's going to recreate a moment. That said, I would say find a work of history that has a lot of different kinds of voices in it. Whatever that, and again, it's hard for me to recommend one thing, but like something, for example, Erica Dunbar's book about Ona Judge. I forget the name of it every time I mention it. It's about one of George Washington's enslaved people and how she tried to escape. What's useful about that book, first of all, it's very accessible, but what's useful about that book is it does what we've been talking about, which is flip the mythology on its head. And Washington isn't just this wonderful guy, being the best president. He's a slaveholder who's trying to chase down a person who he owns. So, I would say, I love Pauline's book, but I would suggest that people read really broadly and allow all kinds of different voices in, because it's the absence of those voices that's led us to this moment, and that we're wrangling with right now.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think that's in some ways, unfortunately, we're out of time, but like, this is kind of a wonderful place to stop in some ways, because, you've just reminded us of the humanity of the people that we study when we talk about kind of the past, is that these were complex people who had all sorts of kind of things in their head, and they acted in kind of weird, interesting ways, and to think about the primary sources and what they kind of can actually tell us, but also to think about the absolutely amazing work that other historians or all sorts of historians are doing about this particular period, and really all periods, right, in trying to bring out these different voices and how they're influencing not just the study of the past, but really kind of how we live in today's world, right? The debate about monuments is not just one that's kind of ossified, but actually impacts today as well.
No, that's right here. And related to that, I just wanted to make a brief plug. But related to that, it's one of the things I'm trying to do. So Thursday mornings at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern time, I'm doing an ongoing webinar called History Matters, and so does coffee, because I could not do it without coffee. What we do is we talk about something in the past. Often it's a document or an artifact that I'm fascinated by, but we talk about things that are topical, and then I talk about how that can help us understand the present. How does looking at newspapers in the past help us understand how to look at newspapers in the present? So I mention that only because folks might be interested. Let's see if I can do this. It can be found at Thursday mornings at NCHE. It's sponsored by the National Council for History Education. nche.net/conversations. Okay, I'm very proud of myself. So there you go.
Wonderful. And I mean, Professor Freeman, and not just this kind of little thing, which is not a podcast, I have to say every time, it's not a podcast. But Professor Freeman hosts a podcast, Backstory Radio, as well as...
It just ended.
I know.
It just ended? No!
So good.
I'm sorry. Used to host this thing.
I did. It was wonderful. It was this wonderful Actually, okay, so it's archived, all online. So all the episodes are there. It existed for more than 10 years. It was wonderful. It was 4 historians talking to each other about history and doing interviews with other people. I did it for a couple of years. Mind blowing. It literally just ended like last week. But it's all
okay. All right.
Yeah.
So I'm not terribly wrong about having hosted that. No. So but historians with coffee, as Professor Freeman was saying, and then other interests, as well, like Twitter historians on Twitter and stuff like that. There's lots of historians out there. Thank you so much for joining us, Joanne, and thank you so much again to all of you for asking questions. We have like 90 questions that we didn't even have time to get to. I mean, we could go on for hours and hours, but like I can't drink anymore. Like,
no, I'm getting down to the limit. If you want to invite me, you should feel free. I feel much more relaxed now. I was a little nervous about talking history and drinking some form of whiskey, and I feel much better now. So if you ever want to have me back, I would be happy to come back.
We would be absolutely delighted and honored. So and next week, please join us. We move away from this kind of American stuff and back to the Middle Ages, where I myself am much more comfortable. We're going to have 2 guests next week. We're going to be talking about medieval studies and especially the fight against white supremacy, white supremacist appropriation of the Middle Ages, and things like that. So please join us next week. Thank you again, Joanne. Thank you, Varsha. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you had a wonderful Friday afternoon, and to everyone out there, cheers.
Cheers. Hey,
so
cheers.
It was
Thank
really
you guys for doing this.
Yeah.
And thank everyone.
You so much.
Sure.